college is just trying to figure you out, right? It's kind of like a relationship. Before they commit and sign on the dotted line to you coming to their institution, they want to know something about you. And this is what I think they want to know about you. Will you pay the bills for 4 years, right? So if you're smart enough to do well on the ACT or the SAT, you're probably going to be able to finish classes and pay the bills. And that's really, in my experience with higher education, that's what they really care about, right? They want the money. But you have to take those tests in order to get in. And it's the same thing with graduate programs. Maybe you've not had much experience with graduate programs, but they also want you to take tests. And a lot of times they're different depending on the field that you're in. It could be something like the GRE or the MAT, or there's a whole bunch of different ones that they might make you take. Now, for my first graduate degree that I applied for to get into Grace, I didn't have to do anything. And the reason why is because I wasn't an unknown quantity. I was a known quantity, right? I'd been going to college there for 4 years. They didn't need to know anything more about me than they already knew. So I was able to get accepted into that master's degree without any kind of test. But once I graduated with my Master's of Divinity, I wanted to go straight on and get my Master's of Theology. So I applied at a couple of different institutions, and they did not know Aaron, and so they wanted to know some things about him. And one of those is, how would he do on one of these tests? So I had to go and I had to take the GRE. Now, GRE is kind of just like, the SAT or the ACT, just a little bit higher scale, I guess. So the same kinds of things. You got to know English. You got to know how to write something. You have to know math. Okay, and this is where the roadblock came for me. Math. So my dad taught at a joint vocational school, a career technology center, taught English there. And he always wanted one of his kids to go. My sister did not oblige. So he kind of leaned on me, Aaron, you should come to my school. You should come. So I did. My junior and senior year, I left my high school and I went to this joint vocational school and took accounting. And it wasn't, like accounting like you would normally think of. I mean, basically, they were training you to be a bookkeeper. And so there's people training to be plumbers or dental hygienists or cooks, or nobody there really is college bound, okay? So the types of math that they teach you, we had Algebra 2 and we had trigonometry, but I don't think I learned any algebra or any trigonometry in either of those classes. Because again, these aren't people that are college bound. I mean, we don't need to get overly serious about it. So basically I had Algebra 1, I had geometry my sophomore year, and that was all the math that I had. Now you jump forward to college, and he's like, well, Aaron, didn't you take any math in college? And yes, I did. You have to take a math elective. And so as I'm looking at all the math electives, I'm like, calculus, nope. On down the list. And then I see this one class called The Nature of Math. And I say, that sounds like it. So I signed up for my first semester, my freshman year, for The Nature of Math. And I thought it might be a little philosophical about the history of math. No, it was just like, hey, here's a square. A square has 4 sides. Cool, let's move on. All right, it was not very difficult at all. And you might say, well, Aaron, didn't you go to the joint vocational school and study accounting? Well, this is a dirty little secret. Accountants don't do any math beyond 9th grade level. We just don't. If you're a cost accountant, you might do a tiny bit of algebra. If you're an auditor like Don was, you might do a little bit of probability and statistics. But we don't do that much math. Most of it is just adding and subtracting and dividing. Right? You guys can do that. Okay, so I didn't know math. And so I went out to the Barnes & Noble and I was like looking at this like big section on the GRE, and I just kind of thinking, oh my gosh, which one of these should I buy? So I bought one, and then you take it home and you open it up and you're just staring at all these equations with letters. What are these letters, right? You're trying to figure out, how do I do this math just so I can pass a test so that I can go study theology, really? But I did. I put my nose to the grindstone, and for a couple of weeks I studied math as hard as I could, taught myself high school math just so I could take this test and get into a program that I didn't even end up attending in the first place. So there you go. A lot of work for no good payoff, right? But, I did learn a lot about equations. When you think about algebra, isn't that what it is? Isn't algebra just learning how to deal with equations? So what is an equation? Let's think about that for a second. Equation has something in the middle of it. What is it? Boom, an equal sign, right? Equation, equal sign. And so the idea is we've got terms on one side of the equation, we've got terms on the other side of the equation. And we know one thing that's going to help us to figure out any variable that we might not know. And that one thing is that whatever's on this side of the equal sign equals whatever's on that side of the equal sign. And that's how we can do the algebra. That's how we can figure out all these different variables. All that to say, today we are going to learn an equation. And that equation is the grace equation. And if you've been around me long enough, you know that I talk about the grace equation a lot. Because I think if you boil Christian living down, it comes down to this. And that is, on one side of the equation, we have everything that Jesus has done for us. Everything that he has done for you. He left the very throne room of heaven and entered into this earth, this sin-filled, cursed earth, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because he wanted to take on your sin so that you could have a right relationship with God. Not only did he come into this world and live in this world filled with sin and suffering, but he actually suffered. Not because of his own sin, but because of other people's sin. Not only that, but he went to the cross, a criminal's death, because of you and I. You know, already in 2 Corinthians, Paul has said that God made him who knew no sin. Who's that? It's Jesus. God made him who knew no sin, meaning he's not a sinner, made him sin. What does that mean? It didn't mean that he made him lie or something. It means that he actually literally put the sins of the world on his shoulders, when he gave himself on the cross. God made the one who knew no sin to become sin. Why? So that we might become the righteousness of God. So that we could have a right relationship with God. And so that we could exhibit his character in this dark world. So there's an equation here, I think, when it comes to Christian living. What Jesus has done for us should equal, or at least we should try to make it equal, what we do for God's kingdom, what we do for others around us. I think that sums up Christian living. So if you think about it in the parable in Matthew 18, the parable of the debtor. If you remember, the debtor goes to the king and he's begging, I owe you an astronomical amount of money and I can't pay it back. Will you please forgive me the loan? And what does the king say? No, pay me every last penny or I'm going to throw you in jail. He says, there's no way I could work my whole life, every day, every hour, making as much money as I can. I'll never be able to pay you the debt back. And so the king says, fine, it's forgiven. That's pretty good news, right? That's hugely good news. So what does the debtor do then? Okay, who's no longer a debtor? He walks outside of the king's throne room and he sees a guy who owes him $20. And he walks over to him and says, hey, dude, where's my 20? If you don't pay me the 20, then I'm going to throw you in jail. And so we sit there and we scratch our heads and we go, how could you do that? How could you be forgiven an astronomical amount, this side of the grace equation, and then go out and demand that somebody pay you $40? It doesn't make any sense. And it's the same thing. Once we really understand what Jesus has done for us, this side of the equation, then how in the world on this side of the equation are we going to say, I don't really care to live for God at all. I don't really care to follow him or love the people that he loves or do anything that he tells me to do. It don't make any sense. So I think Christian living should boil down to this grace equation. We should live for Christ because of all that he has done for us, and that includes generosity. Okay, so because Jesus has been so generous to us, we need to be generous to other people. And that's where we get our central truth today. Because of what we have and what has been done for us, that's the right half of the grace equation, or left half, we should be extremely generous. And when I say generous, Paul's going to talk mostly about money here. And I don't want you to hear me just talking about money, because I think it goes beyond that. Each one of us are resource holders. Okay? We hold financial resources, we hold talent, we hold our experiences, we hold all sorts of things, time. These are resources that God has given to us that we can be stingy with, and we can hoard them for ourselves, or we can be giving of them. We can give them to the work of God. We can give them to help other people grow in their relationship. All right, so we're kind of shifting gears here in 2 Corinthians. The first 7 chapters, were about Paul and his rocky relationship with the Corinthians and trying to get that back on the right pathway. And in chapter 8, we kind of have an abrupt turn. We're going to talk about giving for 2 chapters, so 3 sermons. We're going to talk about giving. And then in chapter 10, the letter kind of takes a little bit of a darker turn. And so this has led some people to think, well, this was never originally one letter. This was a bunch of different communications that Paul had. And so maybe there was the letter about the giving, and then there was the letter that was chapters 1 through 7, and then there was another letter that's 10 through 14. I don't know that we have to go there. I think that there is a lot of unity here, even though it doesn't seem to be. So I think that the real reason that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians was about this collection to the Jerusalem saints. So Paul's thinking about the Jerusalem church. They were there at the beginning, right? And Peter told them, which we're going to look at next week, Peter said, or Jesus said to them, you start in Jerusalem, and you go to Judea, Samaria, and then to the outermost reaches of the earth. Be missionaries. That's what he told them. Be missionaries. And so they did that, and they spent a lot of their own money and a lot of their own resources and a lot of their own time to send people around the globe, like Paul, to plant churches. Now they find themselves in extreme poverty. And so Paul, one of his visions is with all these new churches that he's planted, some of them poor churches, some of them wealthy churches, but they should give back a little bit to the Jerusalem church. They should take up a collection. They should help the people of Jerusalem in their poverty. And so Paul has had this vision for years at this point. He's been going around to churches and collecting this money. And he really believes in this mission to help the Jerusalem poor. And the Corinthians, the year earlier, had said, we'll give. And the Corinthians were a very wealthy church. We'll give. Just let us sign on a dotted line. And so here we are a year later, and guess how much the Corinthians had given? Goose egg. And so Paul is trying to say, okay, remember what you said a year ago when you said you were going to help the Jerusalem poor? Why haven't you done it yet? What's going on? Why aren't you being generous? And so that's what chapter 8 and 9 are about. And I think how it's connected to the first 7 chapters is that Paul kind of had to deal with this relationship that had been rocky, but now was getting back on track before he could then point his finger at them and say, yeah, you remember what you said you would do? You haven't done it. So we have to kind of heal the relationship a little bit first before then we can begin prodding them forward in a different direction. And so that's what we're going to see here in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And we're going to learn a lot of principles of giving. We're going to learn about why we should give as well. And that's what I want to talk about here this morning. So look at verse 1 of chapter 8. And we're going to see the first reason why we should give. Now we make known to you, brothers and sisters, the grace that God has given to the churches of Macedonia, that during a severe ordeal of suffering, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in the wealth of their generosity. For I testify that they gave according to their means and even beyond their means, and they did so voluntarily, begging us with great earnestness for the blessing and fellowship of helping the saints. And they did this, not just as we had hoped, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. Okay, so the first thing that Paul is doing is he's pointing out a good example of giving. So one reason that we give is in order to follow in the footsteps of the generous saints that have gone before us. And the Macedonians are some of those saints. All right, so I'm going to talk about Sarah here for a second. All right, Sarah, my daughter, can be a very generous person. Like, she's a very generous person. So what do I mean by that? I hope that that's the kind of adult that she turns out to be, but that is definitely the kind of kid that she is. She doesn't have any inflow of money, right? She just started mowing lawns last summer, so she's got a little tiny bit of inflow of money, but besides that, it's basically been Christmas gifts and birthday gifts. That's the only money that she has. Yet, she'll go to the store. She likes to spend her money on one thing and pretty much one thing only, and that's snacks and candy from Dollar General. So we'll go to Dollar General, she'll buy a bunch of snacks, and then she'll come home. Now, if it was me, and I had a scarce resource, money, that wasn't really coming in very regularly, and I got to go to the store and buy one thing that I liked and take it home, the last thing I would do when I got home is say, hey, you want some? I wouldn't do that. I'd eat it. I'd be like, you got your own money. Go buy your own snacks, right? But that's not the way Sarah is. Sarah will come home, and the first thing she does when she opens up the bag of chips, hey, you want some of these Funyuns? And I'll be like, okay. Hey, you want some of these Neckos or whatever it might be? And she shares. To me, that reflects a generous spirit. I'm not saying that the rest of my kids are not generous. I'm just picking on Sarah here for today, right? But she's got a very generous spirit. Giving, even though she doesn't have much. My grandfather was a very giving person. That's why I got a B-17 up here. He flew in one of these during World War II. But he's a very giving person, just always willing to help whenever there's a financial need with one of his kids or grandkids. And I remember I used to think, even 10, 15 years ago, he must just have tons of money socked away somewhere. Okay, we come to find out when he passed away and we saw his estate. No, he doesn't. He didn't have any money socked away. So what does that tell you? That tells you that every dime the guy had, he was giving away. He was giving it to his kids. He's giving it to his grandkids to help them to succeed in life. This generous spirit, that generosity, even though maybe not having much, still, reflecting the character of God. And Paul points to the Macedonians and he says, these people were this way. So who are the Macedonians? Okay, so Macedonia is in modern day Greece, the northern part of it. And there's a few churches that were up there. There is Philippi. We're familiar with that because of the letter of Philippians. There's Thessalonica. We're familiar with that, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And Berea. We're familiar with that, with the gospel, with the book of Acts, where Paul talks about be a Berean, and they were able to search scriptures in order to figure out what Paul was saying was right. So we know all three of those churches, and there are probably some more that are lesser known. But Paul says these Macedonian churches had been going through a pretty terrible ordeal. And we don't know exactly what that is, but we would figure that it was persecution, and probably because from the Jewish people. We saw that with Paul. Paul was in Thessalonica only 2 weeks before the synagogue and the Jewish people ran him out of town. And so there were probably a lot of persecution going on from the Roman government, from civic life, from the synagogue. And so because of that, they were poor. A lot of them might not have been able to hold down jobs because they wouldn't toe the party line, but they gave. And what's interesting to me is how Paul kind of lays this out. And I think this might be what happened. Paul's making this big collection, and he goes to the church of Philippi, which we know that's where I think it's where he's at when he wrote, when he met Titus here. And he goes to them and he says, yeah, I'm keeping this collection. I'm gathering up this collection for the poor in Jerusalem, but you don't have to give. I think this is how it went down. You don't have to give. I know that you guys are extremely poor right now. Maybe someday you're richer. Maybe someday you got more resources than give. But right now, you probably can't afford it. That's okay. There's seasons in life. And that's true, right? When you're just starting out and, you just got lots of little kids and you probably don't have much money, you probably don't have much time. And then there are other points in your life, where the kids might be out of the house and, your bank account starts to fill up and you have more time and more money. There's different stages of life with which you can use different types of resources in order to give. And I think that's all Paul's trying to say is, maybe this isn't the time for you to give money. Maybe this is the time for you to give time or talent or something else. But the Macedonians here beg to give. Let us give. We want to give. Even though we have nothing, we still want to be part of this. We still want to see the mission of God go forward. We still want to help the poor that are in Jerusalem. What an example. What a great example of generosity. What a great example of people trying to balance that equation. Because of what Jesus has done for me, because of what Jesus has done for us, we want to be generous to the people around us. And so they gave, and they gave voluntarily, and they gave liberally. They gave against expectation. Paul did not expect them to give a lot, but they gave anyway. And so now he's turning to the Corinthians here, and he's saying, well, what about you? All right, here are these Macedonian churches who have nothing, yet they're giving. Here's you. You have a ton, and you've given nothing, even though you told me that you would. You need to follow these good examples of generosity. All right, so let's talk here about Christian giving. Okay, so Christian giving was never meant to be a legal obligation. I think many churches kind of turn it into that. I know there's a lot of churches when you become a member, you actually sign on the dotted line. This is how much money I'm going to give, and they can make it feel like it is a legal obligation. But the New Testament never lays down a rule okay, this is how much you need to give. Now, it does say that we should be giving and generous people. But I can't find a single place where Jesus or Paul or anybody says, well, this is the percentage of your income that you need to give. In order to get that, you got to go back to the Old Testament law, which Paul repeatedly tells us that we no longer live under. So you've got this legal obligation that we find in the law, and sometimes we try to bring that into today, but it doesn't belong here today. So let's talk a little bit about the Old Testament, because I think that just because we don't have to follow the letter of the law does not mean we can't learn from it. There's not principles there that we can learn. I think that's true about giving as well. So when God gave the law to the people of Israel on Mount Sinai, an integral part of this new legal system was the tithe. Okay, so what is a tithe? Tithe literally means a tenth, to give a tenth of what you have. And so here's a passage from Leviticus 27. Do I have it up there? I do. All right. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It's holy to the Lord, and whoever would redeem any of their tithe must add a fifth of the value to it. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod shall be holy to the Lord. So basically, the legal obligation here, 1 in 10. 1 out of every 10 things that you have, you should give. 1/10. The problem is, this isn't the only tithe that we read about in the Old Testament law. There are actually 3 tithes. Okay, so what are these 3 different tithes? Okay, so the first tithe is the one up here, and this was used to make sure that the worship of the Lord ran smoothly. So, the temple establishment with the priests and the Levites and the sacrificial system, making sure all the festivals were run correctly, probably also the synagogues that you would attend every week, that they had enough to be provided for. That's what this 10% was used for. Then there was a second tithe that we learn about. And, I kind of think about it like maybe you've had a health savings account at work, or maybe you've had an IRA at work or 401k. And what do? You set aside a portion of your income for a specific purpose for yourself. Okay? So, you set aside money for your health, and you're supposed to use that money on your health. You set aside a portion of the money for your retirement. You're supposed to use that money for your retirement. So you benefit from it, but you're still at the same time setting aside a portion of it every year. And that's what the second tithe sounds like to me as you study it a little bit. God not only wanted his people to give to the worship of the church, God wanted his people to take part in the worship of his church, in the worship of the Old Testament cult. So, that meant going to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, maybe during a festival, whether that be the Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Feast of Weeks. You would go to Jerusalem, and if you did that, you had to pay for transportation to get there, and you had to pay for animals to sacrifice when you were there, and you had to find a place to stay and probably pay for that. You had to pay for meals. And so that's what the second 10% was. So set aside another 10th of your income to make sure that you're able to take part in the worship of God. And then the third tithe happened every 3 years. So we could kind of divide that out, right? 33.33% of your income every year. And that was for the poor. So set aside 3.33% of your income every year to help take care of the poor. So we might not be under legal obligation to give, 33, let's do the math. 10 plus 10 plus 3 1/3. 23.33% of our income. We might not be under that legal obligation, but I do think we can learn from it. I'll talk about that here in a second. But this was such a legal obligation in the Old Testament that if you did not do it, you were robbing God. That's kind of a strange thing to think about, but you would think, God laid down the law, everybody followed it. Yeah, right. Hardly anybody followed it. And so God, through the prophets, sometimes kind of yells at them a little bit. We looked at one of them last summer when we were studying the book of Malachi, but I'll reread it to you here this morning. This comes from Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. So this was such a legal obligation that when the Israelites were not following it, God doesn't come and say, hey, you stingy people, why aren't you giving to the Lord's work? He says, you're robbing me because 1/10 of everything you own belongs to me. And so you keeping it for yourself is highway robbery. So we don't live in that part of the story anymore. We're not underneath the Mosaic covenant anymore, where, physical blessings are attached to giving, or physical curses attached to not giving. In the Christian part of the story, things have changed a little bit. But it doesn't mean that we're not supposed to be generous and that we're not supposed to be giving. I think we can learn a great deal here by looking at these 3 different tithes. So what should be the principles here? Well, we want to make sure that the work of God is funded. A, right? B, we want to make sure that we're able to take part in it and that we're able to use the gifts and resources that he's given to us. Whether that be to go to a conference or buy a book or whatever that's going to help enrich our spiritual life, go to some sort of counseling or something. 3, we want to make sure that the poor are taken care of. I think we can learn a lot. We don't necessarily have to say, okay, 10% to who now? Who do I write that check out to now? No, we just have these principles that, yes, we're supposed to be generous because of how God was generous to us. We need to make sure that the churches are well funded. We need to make sure that we're able to take part in that worship, and we want to make sure that those who are poor among us are able to have enough. These are the things that should drive our giving and our generosity. So we belong to God because he made us and he bought us through the blood of Jesus. Therefore, we give in response to that grace. That's the grace equation. So because God has been so generous to us through Jesus, we want to be generous to other people. And it's not, okay, God told me here on this side of the equation that I need to give a certain number. I gave a certain number, end of story. I think that this is a little bit a higher standard, okay? In reality, I think it's a lot higher standard. Really easy just to say, okay, 1/10 of everything that passes under the rod, here you go, God's yours. It's a lot harder to say, in light of everything that God has done for me, what have I done for him? In light of everything that God has done for me, what have I done for God's people made in his image? I mean, law's so easy. I mean, it'd be so much easier for me to get up here and just say, hey, let me tell you what the Lord says. He says, give 1/10 of your every dollar that you have. 10 cents goes to God. End of story. Let's move on. Okay, but I think it's a higher standard than that. And it's not about just signing a check. It's about loving the Lord. God wants us to give generously because we love him. I think there's kind of a pyramid, say, of motives. And I think, all the motives appeal to us at some point, but I think there are more noble motives than others. Okay, so let's talk about the bottom motive. I don't want to be punished. Okay, so I do something. Okay, we see this with our kids all the time, right? Don't run in the house with the fork or I'm going to spank you or whatever it might be. There's a fear of punishment aspect of it that causes their behavior to change. We can move up to the next level, I think, is duty. I'm supposed to do this. It's the right thing. So you do it. Maybe you don't want to do it, but you grudgingly do it anyway. Move up to the next one, and it's reward. God promises us rewards if we follow him. Under the old covenant, it was physical blessings. Under the new covenant, it's spiritual blessings. But we do some things for reward. And then at the highest level, I think, is out of love and gratitude for what God has done for us. And I think that's the motive that Paul's trying to lay out here, this grace equation. Because of what God has done for us, we should want to be generous and giving people, giving of our resources, whatever they may be, whether that's money, maybe we don't have money, so maybe it's time. But we all have resources that we can use for the glory of God and to help the people that are in our lives. So if the New Testament does not bind us to tithe, does that mean that we should just be careless and random givers? And I think the answer to that is also no. We see here that there's some proportionality to giving. Paul says, hey, before I come, I'm going to come to you, Corinthians, I'm going to take the money that you set aside. So while this is happening, set aside a portion of your income every week, and then when I come, I'll be able to collect it all. And so I think Paul's trying to say that there should be some sort of pattern and some sort of decision that you make in your mind, and you stick to it. There's no magic number. It's not like, okay, set aside 12% or 10%, but just set aside some proportion of your income and continue to do it, not haphazardly, but with some gusto and with some clarity. All right, so America. America is one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. So what would we expect from one of the wealthiest nations on the planet? Now, we would expect it to be one of the biggest givers in the world. And there is no doubt that we are among the most generous in the world. But let me put some perspective on that. So this recent survey, 3% of Americans give 10% of their income or more away. So 3%. Now you might say, well, that's Americans as a whole. What about the church? What about the evangelical church? Well, only 6% of, self-proclaimed, born-again evangelical Christians give a tithe or more, give 10% of their income or more. It's pretty low. Now, the study I read gave all sorts of reasons why this may be, but I think a lot of them boiled down to me, this idea that it kept being pressed upon me. Just because somebody is prosperous does not mean that they are generous. And just because somebody's not prosperous doesn't mean that they're stingy. Okay? And we know this from Jesus. Remember Jesus in the last week of his life, he's sitting there in the temple courts with his disciples, and these big guns come in, and they start throwing all this money into the temple treasury so that everybody could see. And Jesus isn't all that impressed. And then this little old lady comes in, and she puts in a couple of small copper coins, and Jesus says, you see that? That's impressive. That's all she had to live on. And so we learned something there. It's not about the amount of the gift. It's about the spirit and the heart of the giver. They gave out of their plenty, but she gave all that she had to live on. They gave maybe to impress other people. She gave because she wanted to see the mission of God go forward. So this is the grace equation, right? What God has done for us on this side of the equation, on the other side of the equation, how can we be generous in return? We don't want to be like that debtor who is forgiven this huge debt and then says, but I'm going to require everybody else to pay me. No, we want to reflect that generosity. And I think that's the one thing that good examples of generosity do in our life is they tell us that. Like, man, this person was so giving to me. How dare I live my life in such a way where I'm not generous with the rest of those around me? And so Paul points to the Macedonians here to try to get the Corinthians back on track to make sure that they finish what they started. All right, the second reason that they should give, we find in verses 6 and 7. So first one's to follow the good examples. This one is so that they might have all the graces. Look at verse 6. Thus we urge Titus that just as he had previously begun this work, so also he should complete this act of kindness for you. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in all eagerness, and in the love from us that is in you, make sure that you excel in this act of kindness as well. Okay, so this is the second reason here, so that you might be well-rounded, so that you might have all of the graces. The Macedonians completed what they started. You need to complete what you started. You need to give. Now, you have all these other great spiritual gifts. You need this one too. You need to have kindness in your heart and generosity in order to help these poor people in Jerusalem. So I just want to talk for a second about poor Titus. And we talked about him last week quite extensively. How Paul sent him with the severe letter to Corinth, kind of bashing them on the head a little bit, like, hey, you had all these false teachers, and you had this really terrible person stand up to me and question my authority while I was there, and this stuff needs to be fixed. And here's good old Titus, and he's carrying this letter to the Corinthians. He's like, are they going to make me sleep on the street? Because this isn't the best of news. All right, so things go well for Titus. The relationship starts to heal. Titus goes and tells Paul the great things that have happened. And then Paul says, just a moment, I'm going to write another letter, and I'm just going to send you back. This time, I want you to tell them, you promised you were going to give, you haven't given yet. Titus is like, goodness gracious. How many times am I going to have to go kind of bearing this kind of news? But that's what this letter really, the heart of it is about, hey, you promised that you were going to give, now is the time to give. And when you do, then you're going to be well-rounded. So I think sometimes we think about spiritual gifts, like I have a couple of gifts, but then the rest of them I don't have to worry about. But I don't think the New Testament teaches that we are supernaturally gifted by the Spirit in certain areas, but it doesn't mean we need to neglect the others. So, for instance, I think one of the spiritual gifts is faith. There are people that have amazing faith, and I think that that's supernaturally given to them. Now, does that mean somebody like me who does not have the gift of faith, I don't have to have faith? Of course not, right? There are people that are supernaturally gifted. One of their spiritual gifts is generosity. Does that mean because there's a spiritual gift of generosity, then I don't have to be generous? Of course not. There are people that are gifted speakers and they're able to dissect the Word of God well. And does that mean that if I don't have that gift, that I don't have to read the Bible? You can see what I'm saying, is that we need to be well-rounded. And generosity is one of those gifts. And so Paul says, you got faith, that's great. You got the gift of the Word, that's good too. You got knowledge, I'm happy for you. You've got love. You've got diligence. You've got all these great things. One grace that you don't seem to have is the grace of grace, the grace of generosity. And you need to step up and you need to be a little bit more generous. And so he's urging them to be more well-rounded. Here's another reason that they're to give. Look at verse 8. I'm not saying this as a command, but I'm testing the genuineness of your love by comparison with the eagerness of others. So what's he saying there? I think he's trying to say, okay, you can say that you love people all that you want, but if you're not doing anything about it, do you really love them? So if we put our grace equation back up there, okay, so on this side is everything that God has done for us, all the love that he has shown to us. And then we go over onto this side and we have, well, I told that person that I like them. I told that person that I hoped that they would be warm and well-fed. I told that person that I wanted to be generous to them. But did you do something? well, not yet, maybe someday. That's not how it works, right? Prove your love or prove what you say by action. And so that's what Paul's saying. The Macedonians, they did something. They didn't just talk about it, they gave. You need to stop talking about it, and you need to give. And you might call this what it really is. Sometimes we don't like to think this about the Apostle Paul, but this is kind of a guilt trip. You said you were going to do this, you haven't done it, now get it done. The Macedonians did it. Why haven't you? So yeah, there is some logical, common sense kind of guilt that Paul's laying on here, but he's trying to get them to prove their love by their actions. Another reason that they should give is because Christ gave so much for them. And this is the one that I kind of was focusing on here with the grace equation. Look at verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that although he was rich, he became poor for your sake, so that by his poverty you might become rich. All right, so because Christ gave so much for us, kind of similar to he made the one who knew no sin to become sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. He made the one who was rich to become poor, so that we might become rich. Same thing. All that Jesus has done for us should motivate us to want to be generous with the people around us, with the church, and the mission of God. Another reason is because it was what's best for them. Look at verse 10. So here's my opinion on this matter. It is to your advantage, since you made a good start last year, both in your giving and in your desire to give, to finish what you started, so that just as you wanted to do it eagerly, you can also complete it according to your means. For if the eagerness is present, the gift itself is acceptable according to whatever one has, and not according to what one does not have. So he says here, basically, it is what's best for them to collect what they can, what's in keeping with their income. Since their income is higher, they should be giving, they should be generous. Complete what they started. So I think we're kind of like the Corinthians in a couple of ways. One, we're wealthy. We're a wealthy country. Even the poorest among us is wealthy by the world standards. The Corinthians were wealthy. We live in a kind of a decadent, idolatrous land where too many people put something above God in what they worship. We also, like the Corinthians, abound in a lot of flashy spiritual gifts. But maybe we're not as generous as we should be. I can think of examples of generosity. But I think if I could lay out all the examples I can think of in my mind, I think of more examples of non-generosity, especially in my own heart. I can think, yeah, here's a time, Aaron, where you were generous. And I can think, well, here's 10 other times where you weren't. And so I think that it's something that we need to kind of look in the mirror and say, are we generous? And it could be because we just don't have cash flow. And I think that's another problem that we might have in America as well. I try to get Haitians to understand this all the time, because a Haitian, when they see you, they think, you make how much money a year? That's a lot of money that you can be giving away. All right? They don't understand, okay, well, yeah, I make this amount of income, but I have this amount of expenses every month. They don't really understand that monthly expense there. They don't have a utility bill. They don't have rent or a mortgage payment. And so they don't get it. They think everything that comes in that you should be able to give and go out. And that's just not the way we live, right? We have so many obligations that we're supposed to meet. And some of those obligations are common sense, and we should have them. It's house debt or something like common sense house debt, common sense student loan debt. These are things that give you a leg up. But there are other kinds of debt that probably crush us, like excessive credit card debt, excessive student loan debt. These kinds of things that kind of dry up our cash flow and make it hard for us to be generous. So Paul here is not measuring a church's success by the size of its sacrifices. He's measuring its success by its willingness and ability to give. The Macedonians were poor, not successful by any human standard. You wouldn't be able to go into their church and say, wow, look at all these rich people. They were poor. You wouldn't be able to say, look at all these people. There's so many of them. They were small, but they gave sacrificially. And because of it, God was pleased. And it's the same thing with us. Whatever our cash flow situation might be, maybe we don't have any cash at all, but we've got time. Maybe we don't have much time, but we've got money. Maybe we don't have much money or time, but we've got our experiences that we can give to somebody. We should just want to balance that grace equation. Because Jesus was so generous to us, we want to be generous to other people. Because in the end, it's what's best for us. Now, you might be able to turn on TBN this morning, and there might be a preacher up there that would say to you, sow a seed. Give me $1 and $10 will come back to you. It's not what the New Testament teaches. The New Testament does not teach that when you give, you're going to get it back tenfold. Now, it does say when you give, you're going to get it back tenfold. So what does it mean? It means that you're going to get it back in spiritual blessings. You're going to get it back in satisfaction and knowing that you were part of the plan of God. That you're going to get it back in peace and love that you show to other people and relationships that you're building. It comes with spiritual blessings. And Paul's saying that to them here. It's what's best for you in the long run. And we should give, willingly. It should be something we want to do. In Europe, a lot of the churches were at one point state churches. So the church and the state were the exact same thing. So if you can think about Germany, Germany and the Lutheran Church were the same thing. You can think about England and the Anglican Church were the same thing. And so you still see vestiges of that today, even. So there is a mandatory tithe in Germany. So like if you are on the roll of a church, if you're on a membership roll, then the government automatically takes 8% of your income and then remits that to that church. And that's now it might not be a big deal here. You can come and participate in everything you want to without being a member. But in a church like the Catholic Church or even the Lutheran Church, where you can't take part of the sacraments or different things if you're not a member, so you sign on the dotted line and all of a sudden the government's taking 8%. So the free will gifts, so they take offerings at those churches in Germany. Guess how much their free will gifts are? They're 60 cents a person per year. That's how much that they take in free will gifts. Because, they're flush with cash, but the reason why is because the government is taking money and then giving it to them. And so it's no longer kind of a willing, generous in the moment type of thing. It's a kind of a mandatory thing if you want to be part of this organization. So, that's not what Paul's after. Paul's after people who want to give because of what Jesus has given to them. All right, the last reason is to level the playing field. So look at verse 13. For I do not say this so that there would be relief for others, but suffering for you, but as a matter of equality. At the present time, your abundance will meet their need, so that one day their abundance may also meet your need, and thus there may be equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Okay, so this is the last reason that Paul points out to give here in these verses, is to level the playing field. Giving of our resources liberally, giving of our time, giving of our talent, giving of our whatever God has given to us. You might say, well, Aaron, man, is Paul a socialist? What's wrong with him? He'd probably be called one today. But I think there are some significant differences between what maybe someone like Karl Marx taught and what somebody like Paul is teaching. Marx taught that all people should be mandated to give. Paul's not going in that direction. Paul is saying that people should want to give. They should want to make sure that the poor among them are taken care of. They should desire to give in order to balance that grace equation. Marx taught that we should give out of loyalty to the state. Paul's teaching that we should give because of all that God has given to us. We should want to help raise the circumstances of the people in the church around us. Compulsion would take the joy right out of it. So Paul's anticipating an objection here. How much do I have to give? You're telling me I need to be generous. So should I give so much money to Jerusalem? Should I give so much money that now I'm poor and I'm suffering? Paul's like, no, it's not how this is working out. No, we just want there to be some measure of equality, right? We don't want to have these really, really, really wealthy people in the church and these really, really, really poor people in the church. And this was a big problem in the church of Corinth. If you look at the middle part of the book of 1 Corinthians about how they were taking communion in an improper way, that's what was happening. It's like kind of like like our breakfast next week. But instead of bringing in all of our dishes and us sharing them, what was happening in the Corinthian churches, you would bring in your own meal for your own family. And so you had these people with filet mignon on the left, and then you had somebody with their peanut butter and jelly on the right. And Paul's saying, what you're doing is you're reinforcing these class differences in the church, and they shouldn't be there. And so he's kind of trying to say the same thing here. If you've got really wealthy people and really, really poor people, and the wealthy people aren't helping the poor people, there's a problem with that. There should be some sort or some measure of equality there, where those who have give to those who don't. And maybe there comes a point in life where that flips, and they have and you don't. And hopefully they help you at that point. And so he says, give so that there might be some measure of equality. And he cites an Old Testament passage to kind of prove his point here. And it comes from the wilderness generation. So the wilderness generation were the people that wandered around in the desert for 40 years. And what did they get every morning when they woke up? They got one piece of manna. Everybody had one piece of manna. And so what if you wanted two, and you wanted to save one for tomorrow? So say you got two on a Monday. You went out there and got one. I'm going to keep one for tomorrow. And you stuck it in your house and you put it in your refrigerator. You woke up the next day, it would be rotting and bug infested. God would not let you do it. And it wasn't like manna couldn't last for 2 days, because on Friday, God would make you go out and pick two. One for Friday and one for Saturday, so you didn't have to work on the Sabbath, and that was fine. But any other day, if you tried to hoard it and you tried to take one extra, helping for yourself for the next day, it would rot. And so God was enforcing equality pretty strictly there. And so Paul's trying to point at this and say, yeah, there does need to be, or there should be, some sort of measure of equality in the church. And so that leads me to an interesting question. And I think it's the same question we've been asking this whole time. Is our manna rotting, or are we being generous with it? And I think it's the same equation. I think it's the same as saying, are we balancing the grace equation? I think those are two of the same question. Is our manna rotting? Are we being generous in light of the generosity that God has shown to us? All right, let's pray. Dear Lord, again, as we look at the example of the Macedonians here this morning, Lord, who gave even though they had nothing. Lord, we pray that we can be generous people. And maybe there are people here that have no money. Maybe they have time. Lord, I pray that they're able to give their time. Lord, there may be people who have no time, have money. Lord, I pray that they be able to give their money. There may be people here with talents. Lord, I pray that they're able to give their talents to you. Lord, but we just want to have that attitude in us, that willing attitude, that we want to balance that equation, that we understand just what you did, that you became sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. You became poor for us so that we could be spiritually rich. And we can just pray that we can work as hard as we can, the loving Spirit, to be able to help those around us and to show that same kind of generosity in our daily life. We pray that in your wonderful name. Amen.